The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and Flight Bridge Ed in their entirety.
Next up from the Fast Archives, we revisit a talk entitled A Difficult Pill to Swallow, 3 Unforgivable Sins in Medicine. As first responders, we're used to the stress and pressure of keeping ambulances running and serving our communities, but what happens when we bring that same intensity home and into our personal life? Kris and Sara Kaull delve into why we struggle with self-care and maintaining relationships when we're off duty. Through personal stories, they explore why it's so challenging to let go of the rescuer mindset when we're with family and friends, and give you some homework related to the 3 unforgivable sins in medicine. This talk is all about stripping away the facade and learning to be present, not just for ourselves, but for those we care about. It's about finding balance in a career that's all about giving to others. Join us as we delve into this timely and much-needed conversation. We hope this speaks to you as much as it did to us. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the episode.
Wow, between the video and the lights, all I need is Brandon's microphone to feel like Britney Spears standing up here. Well, thanks for having us here. Fun fact, Kris and I have actually never spoken together before. So what I can guarantee you today is that whether it goes good or not so good, that we will at least be illustrating for you everything we're about to talk about live. So that'll be fun. A lot of you, as Brandon said, already know Kris. You've heard him speak probably, and you learned just a touch about me, brains of the operation and all. But what you would not ever find out about me reading a bio is that I am a reforming perfectionist. For a good portion of my life, I was obsessed with control, keeping up appearances, making sure that I presented the perfect version of myself to the world. It was exhausting, but it was also what I thought the world required of me. In fact, the world rewarded me for it from a very young age. It started in kindergarten with my first gold star for good behavior and good work. And that set me on a path of filling my calendar more and more and more to see if I could actually execute all of that perfectly. So for 35 years, I added more to my calendar until my world came crashing down and I could no longer keep up appearances, control what was happening around me, or even keep up with my calendar. You see, I was born and grew up in the city, the big city. But as an adult, I chose to move to a small town in Montana, a town with less than 1,000 people. Talk about a culture shock. While I loved the open space and the slower pace of life, adjusting to having locals observe and discuss my life was new, and it was hard. It was especially challenging when my world turned upside down and I gave them plenty to talk about. About 10 years ago, my now ex-husband's mother died of ovarian cancer, and her death set us on a path that we could not have predicted. As he struggled with his grief, my ex went out night after night, drinking, adding to his DUI count, and rumors of his affairs ran rampant around the town. And in the midst of all of that gossip, it was hard to keep my marriage together and hard to know what was actually true. Then came another tragedy. My father was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. So my marriage was a mess. My father was sick. And worse than that, the watchful eyes and judgmental whispers followed me everywhere I went. But it was in that moment that I learned an unexpected lesson. It began the morning I woke determined to change and control the narrative about me. If this little town wanted to gossip, I would give them the juicy details. I would tell my story, every ugly piece, because at least then when they talked about me, they would have to focus on the truth.
A perfectionist, a pleaser, hard workers. How many of us can relate? It's in our DNA. We're helpers, we're caregivers, and we're overcommitted. We pride ourselves on that busyness, right? We pride ourselves on the selflessness that we always are lending a helping hand. So, hey, can you speak at that conference?
Sure.
And, oh, we're moving this weekend. I could use your help. Can you do that?
I guess so.
Or, I know this is a surprise, but there's an open shift this week. Can you cover that?
Yeah, but you're going to owe me.
We've taken care of everyone else, but to our detriment. And we say yes all the time. We say yes because we're scared of the judgment of others. We say yes because we think it's the right thing to do. We say yes because we're polite. We say yes because we don't want to hurt anybody else's feelings. And yet, what if saying yes, helping others, staying busy is actually causing us to stumble? What if saying yes is actually stopping us from all the good things in life and we can never experience the true, authentic us?
Which brings us to the difficult pill to swallow. Stop saying yes to the good in life so that you have space for the great. But isn't saying yes to good things a good thing? Well, not necessarily. Saying yes has a cost. Saying yes creates an obligation. Saying yes commits you to something. And the things that we say yes to, they have a habit of growing. Sure, it's easy to say no to the bad things in life. Kris.
Fast 2023, Brandon and Mike naked on the stage?
Ooh, I don't know.
Or is that a great thing? Yes.
But how do we decipher between the good and the great? That's a little bit harder. And not only that, it's a decision and a journey that's going to be personal to each one of you. However, there are 3 sins. Get it? Sin City. 3 sins that actually stop us from creating space for the great. Sin number 1, not digging into self-care. While I'm a reforming perfectionist, I've been an introvert my entire life. In fact, every time I take that extrovert-introvert test, I'm so far over on the introvert side, I might as well just fall right off the chart. And being an introvert in an extroverted world, it's a challenge. My tank is depleted quickly in many settings. So prioritizing my self-care and my time alone to recharge is essential to my ability to interact positively with the world.
And in medicine, that lack of self-care is the same. Like cerebrally, we get it, right? We should exercise, we should eat right, we should rest, but we decide that we're going to exercise
Next Monday.
Yep. We're going to eat right.
Monday.
And then we do this whole thing. We're going to take that vacation with our family, you know, when things slow down. We have to do something different. We've been talking about it the last 2 days. The stats show it. EMTs, nurses, paramedics, physicians, we are 10 to 15 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts, and we're 2 to 4 times more likely to commit suicide than the general population. What if, instead of helping out everyone else first, you prioritize yourself? But we're caregivers. Seems selfish, right? But consider the new mom with a little born baby, right? Tank's low and running on fumes, exhausted, tired, hungry. And yet, how much better of a care provider would she be if her tank was full? How much better of a care provider would you be if your tank was full?
Exactly, because it's impossible to experience great things if your tank is always empty. For someone like me who's an intense introvert, I need to find time alone on a daily basis. One of the biggest misperceptions about introverts is that we hate people. It's not true. I love people. I especially love deep conversations with people. Being an introvert is not about hating people. It's about how do I refill my tank? My tank only refills through quiet time alone. But if you're an extrovert, your self-care might look different. You might actually need to create time to be around people because your tank refills from the energy of others. So while self-care is going to look different for each of us, keep this in mind. I can only be my best when I'm at my best. I can only give my best when my tank is full. So if I prioritize me, then I'll have the capacity to reach for the great. But how do we fit in self-care when our calendars are so full from sunup to sundown?
Sunup to sundown. Every second is accounted for in our life. And a colleague of mine and I were just talking about this time management. Pointing to you, Kate. Last week, we were saying, how are we going to prioritize everything? But imagine if all of a sudden a crisis happened, that pipe burst, your basement flooded. And now, over the next few hours and days, you're on the phone with plumbers and contractors and getting quotes and getting it fixed. Where did that time come from? Did it magically appear? No. It's that you prioritize that. It's not that you didn't have time. It's that you haven't prioritized you. Bottom line, in order to put yourself first, you're going to actually have to believe in yourself. Feel that you're worthy, that you have value, and make sure that you're carving out you, filling up your tank, and then scheduling everything else. So we're going to give you an assignment. Assignment number 1 for sin number 1. Learn to recognize the signs of when your tank is running low. Uncover those hobbies, passions, activities, quiet time, and then stop. Stop making excuses and build that time.
Exactly. But spending time alone, prioritizing you, it can be oddly scary. We're so unused to it that it opens an entirely new world of being uncomfortable. Which leads us to sin number 2, choosing to stay comfortable. I love to travel. Sure, it's fun to see new places, and I really love to get out of Montana when the winter drags on and on.
It's still snowing.
On.
We're going home to snow.
But more than seeing fun places, I love to travel because it gets me outside of my comfort zone. In the years surrounding my divorce, I decided to take a 3-month sabbatical and travel. Here, my life was spiraling out of control, but I went out of my way to put myself in uncomfortable situations because I knew if I did that, I would be forced to self-reflect. See, being uncomfortable makes my senses come alive, and sorting out why I'm comfortable in a certain situation helps me grow. And it's that growth that has helped me move from settling for the good to holding out for the great.
It's not easy, though. Being uncomfortable with the uncomfortable, it has to be an intentional action. For example, I have 2 huge fears in life. Fear of heights and fear of public speaking.
Good thing you're not on a ladder.
I need focus. But yet, I was so shy going through school that if I broke my pencil, I wouldn't even stand up and walk in front of the class to sharpen it. And I started taking these intentional acts of working in the community and speaking in the community. And I started rock climbing to tackle my fear of heights. And now to this day, I say it's my favorite things I hate. Right? Do you get that? It's tough. It's tough to stand up here. It's tough to be vulnerable. But by placing myself in situations that are outside of my comfort zone, I was allowed to grow. And for you guys, I get it. I'm a clinician of 30 years with you. It's scary. We all want to be liked. We all want to be appreciated. We all want to be valued. We don't want to be judged. And it's the same. Imagine, and you did some of these things on Monday, you're in along your peers doing these critical care scenarios, and yet it's nerve-wracking. What are they thinking about me? You're reviewing the tough calls. We talked about case reviews and positive feedback, or safe feedback is a better word for it, right? And yet, why is, when everybody else has all the answers, but you didn't at that time in the call, why is that anxiety producing? Or for us to stand up here and share stories that aren't always fun stories to you guys, why can that be gut-wrenching? It's because these events buy into this, that's anxiety producing, because it buys into this that we're not good enough. I'm not as smart as you guys. I don't have the experience that you guys do. I'm not as funny as those guys, right? And you add all those things up and say, but by identifying those fears and then facing them head on, you'll find that most of the time, the fear is much scarier than the reality.
So here's your take-home assignment for sin number 2. Determine which specific situations make you uncomfortable and reflect on why. Once you know, do more of those things. In fact, seek these situations as often as you can until being uncomfortable becomes comfortable. Because that in turn is going to make it easier to become vulnerable. And you could probably see where we're heading with this. Sin number 3, not allowing yourself to be vulnerable.
Our world is full of science, facts, figures, and yet many times I believe we hide our insecurities behind the data. It's tough to step out. It's tough to share an idea when it's not the group think. It's tough to act differently. And all of these actions risk our reputation and the perception of who we are. So the quick question is like, hey, Kris, me, third person. Hey, Kris, how do you get great without being vulnerable? You can't. Sure, you'll have moments of great. We always experience great things. But if you want to live a life full of great, you need to be vulnerable. You need to move past uncomfortable to the vulnerable.
Yeah, but it's so much easier to stay walled up. I myself was a master bricklayer for many years. But great and true connection requires vulnerability. It requires courage to speak past your shame and our insecurities and allow for the human connection that comes on the other side.
I remember when I first met Sarah, right? If I didn't, that would be bad. But I also remember our first fight. And it was at the end of a conference like this, and our tanks were low. We had great education, camaraderie, but early mornings and late nights. And we had gone out and to decompress. And I had this kind of playbook, a standard operating procedure or guidelines, COGs. And it was a shot of tequila, chilled Patron, quickly followed by a beer. I'm usually thirsty, so I drink that fast. And then I had my third beer in hand. But my plan is that third beer I nurse throughout the whole rest of the night. And yet I look over at this gal, and there she is, staring me with judgment and contempt, disappointment. I'm like, who does she think she is? And honestly, with a little bit of tequila on board, this is going to be more than a healthy discussion.
Yeah, because as I told you in the beginning of our time together, my ex-husband went out drinking night after his mother died. But the reason for that was because of his addiction. For 12 years, I was married to an alcoholic. And so counting drinks and mentally calculating the time between them had been my role for my whole marriage. So when I saw Kris pick up his third one, I subconsciously went back to that space. My body instantly felt tension and dread and fear, and I responded instinctively without thinking.
And then the unexpected happened. She heard me. She stopped. She said, wow, you're right. This isn't about you. It's about me. You aren't responsible for any of those partners of my past. And then Sarah has this one unique, innate ability to just, whatever she has up here, just drop it and move on.
Yeah, that's because during those hard years, that's when I learned to give up controlling other people. Turns out I couldn't control my ex-husband's behavior, or you can imagine he would have been doing different things. In fact, all I could actually control was my own behavior, my reactions to him, my words, the decisions that I made. And in the process of learning to let go of control, I heard a really wise piece of advice. And it was this: when you're in the middle of an argument, it is really tempting to focus on the blame. Who's at fault? But instead of doing that, give 100% ownership to your percent of the problem. So if I'm only 10% to blame for an argument that we're having, it's my job to focus 100% on my piece of the problem and to apologize for it, and then surrender whether or not my partner does the same. In this particular case, it was 100% my fault. It was my baggage. It was my issues inside of my head that was causing all of my anxiety. It was unfair to judge Kris on the benchmarks I'd made for other people. But it's so much easier to just stay focused on the blame. If I'm pointing and yelling at Kris, we're dealing with his failure and his insecurities and his shortcomings, and I'm off the hook. But that's unfair, and it often leads to broken relationships.
Yeah. Broken relationships with your partners at work, broken relationships with your family, broken relationship with your friends. But vulnerability has that power to do the exact opposite. And in that example, Sara could have been walled up and defensive, but she wasn't. She was vulnerable. Prioritizing self-care, sitting in the uncomfortable, being vulnerable, all of them not easy. Take-home assignment of our third sin. Notice which situation causes you to become skittish and want to run away. But then stay present. Sit in those uncomfortable moments. Challenge yourself when you're tempted to close off. Resist that impulse. Open up.
So that morning in that small town in Montana, I was determined to change the narrative about me, no matter the cost. So I started to write. Not about the day-to-day goings-on and what was actually happening, but instead I wrote about how I was feeling. The sadness of my marriage falling apart, my fear of losing my dad to cancer, the injustice of being judged when I walked down the street. I wrote about all of it, and I posted it for the world to see and braced for their judgment. Yet what started as an attempt to control the narrative became a really powerful lesson about vulnerability. Because with every sordid, sad, and challenging thing I shared, I was met with sympathy and other great things that I can't remember. I met with sympathy and compassion, not the judgment that I was expecting. People I barely knew started writing me notes, offering their support, and sharing stories of things that had happened to them that were similar. I started to replace my toxic friends with new friends who followed my story and reached out to connect. And it's those friends that I cherish today. The ones that happened when I finally let myself be vulnerable in my most vulnerable moment and sharing the real me, not that overcommitted, perfect girl they'd seen for 20 years. When nothing was left hidden, my fear of judgment and my shame, it was all replaced with compassion and understanding and true, deep human connection. And the freedom that that brought has made room for all the great things that have happened since.
You want to lead a great life? You want to have a great career in medicine? You want to be a world changer? Then be willing to prioritize you. Be willing to sit in the uncomfortable. Be willing to be vulnerable. And be prepared for all the great that follows.
This has been a production of the Flight Bridge Ed Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.